like to first start off to say warmly welcome to this very unique and first ever joint webinar between Australia Business Council of Sweden and Swedish Australian Chamber of Commerce. I guess we need to say at this point of time both good afternoon and also good morning. My name is Jan Gardberg, President for SACC, and joining me in this introduction part is also Warren Campbell, who is the Chairman of Australia Business Council of Sweden. So good morning, or maybe I should say in Swedish, god morgon Warren. What a pleasure to jointly host this event together with you. How are you?
Tack Jan. I'm fantastic, thank you. And I share your excitement about hosting this event. I guess it's something we've talked about wanting to do for quite some time. So it's fantastic to finally be able to do it.
Yes, and we had a small chat before we started, and I understood that you have spent quite a long time in Sweden already and mastering the Swedish language with excellence.
Tack så mycket.
So Warren, before we kick off, maybe just a few words about SACC for the new viewers and listeners. So the Swedish Australian Chamber of Commerce, SACC, is actually one of the oldest foreign chambers here in Australia, established already in 1911. We have our main chamber based here in Sydney and cover the rest of Australia out from SACC chapters presented in Melbourne, Victoria, Brisbane in Queensland, and Perth, Western Australia. Plus also we have a highly active young professional subcommittee. And we have around 130 corporate and professional members. And SACC is the largest and most established Swedish-Australian business network here in Australia. And our network includes Swedish, Australian, international companies and professional members and representatives that are interested in Swedish-Australian business. And we even actually have 2 members currently based in Sweden, 100 Points Challenge and Magnusson Law. So what about the Australian Business Council of Sweden? How is your setup in Sweden and how long have you been present there?
We can't boast quite the same impressive history as you can in SACC. We're actually a 5-year-old organization here, so very new. And I would say, as you might expect, I guess, for a young organization, fairly kind of entrepreneurial, and we're growing quite quickly right at this point in time. But the concept is basically the same. I mean, we were set up for Australians in Sweden, Swedes with a connection to Australia, people interested in business opportunities and business networking around the theme of Swedish-Australian business. I would say maybe a difference is that there are less large Australian businesses present in the Nordics compared to large Swedish companies who are operational in Australia. And so I think maybe the themes of our discussions there is maybe a little more around the startup ecosystem, which is extremely strong in Sweden, of course. Smaller and medium-sized business, trade and opportunities between regions. We have around about 50 members, a mix of corporate and professional. And we have maybe 200 plus people in our extended ecosystem who join for particular events and topics. And I would say that one thing that we've been able to do in Corona times is actually increase the number of events, moving much more to a virtual type format. So for anyone who's interested, take a look at our Australian Business .sc website. You'll see a stream of events and things that you can get involved in, and we would very much encourage that.
Sounds like you've had a good growth in the past year. So all the continuous success, Warren. So even though Sweden and Australia is far away and opposite sides of the planet, our 2 countries have been impacted by this global pandemic. And we are all experiencing unprecedented global, regional and local business disruptions. And these are business disruptions that affect any business sector, of course, both in negative and positive ways. And it's also triggering new behaviors in business practice and affecting trade relations, country economies, and global supply chains. So now it's really the time for business communities to come together, not just within countries, but also across country borders. And our 2 chambers here, of course, play an important role for that. So in today's session, we will put in focus business and investment trends between Australia and Sweden. what is the status, what will evolve, develop, what will remain, and what will the new normal be? These are important questions for all of us. So Warren and I also want to extend a special welcome to first distinguished guest is Henrik Cederin, Ambassador of Sweden to Australia and Honorary SACC board member. So welcome very much, Henrik. I also want to introduce Martin Ekberg, Trade and Investment Commissioner and Country Manager to Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. So welcome, Martin, to you also. And you also, Warren, have brought some important guests to this webinar.
Absolutely. It's my great pleasure to introduce firstly Jennifer Mackinlay, who's joining us from the UK, who is Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner for the UK and the Nordics. And those of you in the Australian Business Council in Sweden many of you have met Jennifer before. She's been part of some of our earlier discussions, and she's also responsible for Austrade in the Nordics. Welcome, Jennifer. Great to have you.
Thanks very much, Warren. Good morning, everybody.
And then I'd like to introduce Bernard Phillip, who is the Australian Ambassador to Sweden. And Bernard has been both a very active member of our community and a great supporter. So it's my great pleasure to have Bernard joining us as well.
Thanks, Warren. Thanks, Jan.
Welcome. So to keep all of this together, we need somebody that's going to be moderating. And we also would like to very much to welcome Teresia Fors, who is the Vice President for SACC and also Chair of the Brisbane, Queensland chapter. So she will also be the moderator for today's event. So Teresia, with that, I guess we kick off and over to you.
Thank you so much, Jan. Well, we are certainly delighted to welcome to our discussion today such a distinguished panel, and we will commence our discussion shortly with comments from our panelists on today's topic, business and investment between Sweden and Australia in a post-COVID world. After our entry remarks, we will invite our audience for a Q&A session where you will be able to ask either live, where you raise your hand through the chat function to the right of your screen, or you can write your question to the panelist in the chat function as well. At the conclusion of our webinar, we would be tremendously grateful if you wouldn't mind responding to a very short survey so that we can continue to develop these activities in a very productive way. This webinar will also be recorded and it will be available on our websites afterwards. Throughout the past 6 months, we have in the Chamber run a number of webinars where we have been exploring the legacy of the COVID crisis, trying to understand what we have learned so far and how this experience will change the way we do business. We have brought together many different voices representing different aspects, and we have investigated this crisis and its impact on the economy and trade, but also the impact it has had on our culture and communities. What has been clear throughout these discussions is the need for businesses as well as individuals to adopt and transform, and that trust, inclusion, and collaboration will be the lighthouses that will guide the way forward. However, is that what we see? And let me go for the first comment to Ambassador Bernard Phillip. What is the outlook for trade and investment policy in Australia and Europe post the pandemic? Is there indeed a risk of renewed protectionism?
Well, thanks, Teresia. I think I'd start by saying that we clearly do see some risks, whether it's challenges to the multilateral system in recent years, trade tensions between major powers, whether it's the US and China, or in some cases, the US and the European Union. I think we've also seen countries looking inwards during the pandemic, which in part has been understandable, but I think it has also led to unfortunate actions like the restrictions on the flow of medical supplies that we saw earlier in the crisis. I think there's also a challenge for policymakers as they wrestle with important areas of policy like digital trade or climate in navigating the right balance between good regulation and then actions that possibly stray over into protectionism. I think that the broader risk in all of this is the possible intersection between protectionism and geopolitical competition, they could intersect in a destabilizing way. So I think we do have to recognize that it is an environment we're going to have to work very hard at to manage. On the other hand, I think we do see some bright spots, and I thought I could illustrate that by talking through a couple of examples from Australia and Sweden. I think in Australia's case, you really do see a renewed focus on multilateralism. If you look at some of the recent speeches by our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, it really reflects a consideration by Australia that multilateralism, including in trade at the WTO, including in the G20 and OECD, is more important than ever. And I think we've seen some good signs of that during the pandemic, including the support for the COVAX facility that will provide equitable access to the vaccine when it comes. So that's an Australian example. I think in Sweden, you see a similar renewed commitment to trade liberalisation. Sweden is in the process of preparing its input to a review of EU trade policy. But I think all the indications are that it really wants to double down on trade liberalisation as a key element of building back better. I certainly refer people to a recent agenda on free and sustainable trade put out by the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. It really is, I think, a stirring defence of trade liberalisation at a difficult time. And I think beyond Australia and Sweden, you do see countries and groupings still trying to pursue liberalisation in the face of some of these protectionist risks. I mean, in our region, there's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. There's obviously the Australia-EU FTA, which continues to make good progress. So I think the overall picture is one with some encouraging signs. The final point I'd make is I think post-pandemic, there are some adjustments that are sensible in terms of policies, whether that's on building greater resilience in supply chains, or perhaps giving some greater attention to national security and investment screening. But Australia's view, and I think shared by Sweden, is that it has to be done within a construct of support for free trade.
Interesting. And you mentioned Europe, obviously, as a important partner for Australia. And Europe seems to have doubled down on its commitment to a Green Deal. While here in Australia, we've just recently heard how the Australian government has just released its first low emissions technology statement. With this in mind, what opportunities do you see this present for business and investment between Australia and Sweden?
I think this is one of the most exciting areas of the relationship between Australia and Sweden and Australia and Europe more generally. One thing that you can't help but perceive when you're on the ground here in Europe at the moment is the strong commitment to sustainability and emissions reduction as a central part of the post-COVID economic recovery. I mean, that's been highlighted, I think, most significantly in the revised 2030 target of a 55% fall in emissions, up from 40% in the recent State of the Union by the European Commission President. I think we also see the role that fiscal stimulus can play in driving some of this forward. So that presents opportunities that perhaps didn't exist when we operated in a different fiscal environment before the pandemic. And being here specifically in the Nordics, again, you just get a very powerful sense of companies seeing competitive advantage that can be gained by being an early mover in these areas. And again, when you're sort of speaking to the companies, it seems like there is this endless quest for decarbonisation across all parts of the supply chain. So whilst you might sort of make good progress here, there's always another frontier, which is quite exciting. My sense is you see similar movement in Australia, where we really are on an accelerated drive for emissions reduction. As you mentioned, the government has released its first annual low emissions technology statement with a focus on the 5 priority technologies, including hydrogen and green steel. And I think if you look across those areas, there's plenty of complementarity between Australia and Europe and between Australia and Sweden. Two final things I'd mention. I think at the government level, there's a real opportunity to drive this. And one group that Australia joined late last year is this leadership group on industry transition that's being led by Sweden and India. And I think that presents a good platform. But again, on the corporate side, if you're looking across Sweden, I mean, you're seeing innovation, whether it's the hybrid green steel project or a company like Northvolt really trying to build an industry from scratch. And I think in a lot of these areas, Australia has the capabilities that could really make a difference on both sides. So for me, this field is one of the most exciting parts of the relationship, and I'm sure we'll touch upon this later.
Thank you, Bernard. Well, I can certainly attest to that electricity is so much cheaper in Sweden than what it is here. So I understand why Northvolt is coming with their investment. Now, maybe we'll move over to a Swedish perspective, and if I may invite Ambassador Henrik Cederin, would you mind sharing from your perspective, what are the opportunities and focus areas as you can see them post the pandemic?
Thanks, Teresia, for that question, and thanks to Jan and Warren for hosting this event. It's lovely to be part of this at this historic occasion when we are really connecting Australia and Sweden in a big way with all the relevant actors together. It's really promising for the future that we can interact this way. I guess that's one good outcome of the COVID crisis. And let me just mention the political perspective here also when it comes to Sweden and Australia, and Bernard touched on some things. Thanks to the shift to online meetings, we've had a very good interaction between our governments in the last 6 months. We've had a number of meetings take place, including at the highest level. And that bodes very well for when we take this forward at the corporate level. So we've had to slow down when it comes to visitors. That has been an effect that we all are very familiar with. But we have seen this online exchange explode, and that is very good going forward. I think from a Swedish perspective, looking at opportunities in Australia, it's important. I think it's worthwhile really to take note of the very strong position and the history we have here. All our companies being very active in Australia since way back. We know that the chamber dates back more than 100 years, and there are a number of companies who've been here almost the same in the same length of time. Roughly now we have more than 200 Swedish companies with an established presence in Australia, employing together more than 20,000 people. That is a very good basis, and many of them are seen as local companies with local capabilities. And another perspective is to mention the importance of Australia for us looking east. If we look at Asia Pacific, we know that Australia stands out as a very critical market historically for Swedish companies. So Australia is an important market and will continue to be so. It's a growing economy. It has had great growth. We have the hiccup now with the COVID and all these challenges, but I think the long-term trajectory is good. We have an increasing population here, so Australia will definitely be on the map for Swedish companies and the Swedish government. Two things to mention when it comes to opportunities. We have to drive for local content, local manufacturing. And I think this is something Swedish companies are very well aware of, and that provides an opportunity based on our tradition and also the willingness to establish an even firmer footing. And here it's important to look at what the Australian government is doing, encouraging such steps. We have a manufacturing strategy being presented next week. Very interesting for all of us to look at. The other issue is the focus on sustainability and all the opportunities that this will bring to Swedish companies. And if I dare say so, we have a very strong basis in sustainability. We have, our companies are often leaders when it comes to adapting and adopting a sustainability perspective. So I think what we can offer the Australian market and the new demands in this marketplace, that's a good fit. So I think here we will play a role in the green transition that will take place in Australia. Also with looking at very interesting also to look at from a Swedish perspective. We have finally we have the European Union Australia free trade negotiations take place, and that is, I think, a very good development, and it's also a good in these challenging times when indeed protectionism is on the rise in many corners. I think these negotiations are showing the way, and the belief that we have in free trade as a way of further integration and further welfare for both partners. Thanks.
Thank you. But is there, just following to what you just said, and you mentioned protectionism as well, and sustainability matters, but are there any issues from a global trade perspective that we in particular should pay attention to post-COVID?
No, I mean, the shock that we've seen when it comes to supply chain risks and the tendency that we have seen towards reshoring, as it is called. There are other terms used in the trade negotiations. Strategic autonomy is one such term, and in a way a challenge to the increased openness that we have been witnessing. I think that's really the sentiment and the fear that this crisis has instilled in many governments and around the world. And I think that there we have to be on the lookout and be active in advocacy, because we know that Sweden we've built our strong economy on open trade, and our firm belief is that will be helpful for all countries.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Henrik. Let me call in for Martin Ekberg, who I hope can hear us and we can hear you. Martin, are you there?
Hello, Teresia.
Excellent. I started to feel like the Eurovision Song Contest, calling the different countries, but it's wonderful to hear your voice, yeah. Martin. Thank you so much for joining us. Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Teresia.
From your perspective, obviously you're a local resident now in Australia, and with the optics that you have privilege to, what would you be able to say are the major shifts that we now see in the Australian business landscape that have been accelerated due to COVID-19?
Thank you for the question. Well, yes, I think this is very interesting, right? So in summary, we see 6 major shifts that will be accelerated due to COVID. Some of these shifts were already ongoing pre-COVID, but due to COVID, we see that there's been a massive uptake in some of these areas. 3 of these shifts are industry specific. We see an upgrade of Australian defense capabilities. We see a fast tracking of key infrastructure projects, and we see a growing ambition to drive manufacturing competitiveness. The other 3 shifts are more industry agnostic, and we've already touched upon the sustainability side, but we see an uptake in zero emission technologies that being one of those industry agnostic shifts. Another one is we will see an uptake in digitalization and cybersecurity. Again, have already touched upon that, and I guess that's easy to draw the assumptions that would just increase. Also, we see a growing ambition to diversify Australia's trade footprint in terms of trading partners. So I think this is an interesting one. And if we just double click on this last one, trade diversification, COVID and I would say the ongoing trade conflict between the US and China have in one way exposed Australia's vulnerability when it comes to trade. If you look at Australia's top 4 trading partners, they all account for 56% of Australia's total trade, and that's both import and export. And if you look at China, China alone accounts for over 30%. And what we saw in Q1 this year when China went into lockdown, we saw Australia's trade took a nosedive, both in terms of import and export of goods, with over 10%. So Australia was hit quite hard in an early stage just because it was so tied in together with China. At the same time, coming back to the trade conflict, and we won't dive into that in detail, but what we have seen and what we will see more of, we believe, is that China can impose trade restrictions on Australian goods. Lately, for example, barley, and we believe that this is likely to continue and may expand to include other goods as well. And this creates a lot of uncertainty for Australian exporters. So when we see Australia diversify its trade footprint, there should be opportunities for Swedish companies. And as Ambassador Cederin touched upon, Australia is a very important market for Swedish companies. And you've all heard me talk about how important it actually is, and saying that Australia is Sweden's 4th largest trading partner outside the EU, only beaten by China, US, and Japan. So it is a very important market. At the same time, it's easy to be complacent, if you believe. And if we double click again on the trade numbers during the last decade, we see that trade from Europe and Sweden has in fact decreased with 4 percentage points as a percentage of total trade. And that is of course in favor for Asian countries. So this is something that we will keep a close eye on, and the ongoing trade negotiations with the EU is something that I think would be very favorable going forward for Swedish companies. I would also like to stress another area where we see growing potential, and this is within smart manufacturing. And if we look at Swedish companies tend to have a very solid track record in terms of smart manufacturing, and are viewed as top or industry leaders within their respective fields. At the same time, this has been an area in Australia that's been somewhat neglected over the past years, and it's that bad that Australia ranks the worst in regards to manufacturing self-sufficiency when you compare Australia to other OECD countries. So it is an opportunity to, I would say, increase bilateral knowledge exchange to make this become a more, vibrant manufacturing hub. It's also true that if you look at some of the reasons for this, Australia has been seen as a high-cost manufacturing country. However, when we talk about the new technology and the emergence of new technology enabling Industry 4.0 and a trend towards more regional and local supply chains, we see that this could be the right time to rethink production strategies and make them more local. Today, again, if we look at the export and import figures, 75% of Australian export are raw materials, and 90% of Australian imports are manufactured goods. And this is just likely to change. It has to change. And like I said, it needs to change in order for Australia to become more competitive and more prosperous in a post-COVID world.
Interesting. And for businesses looking to establish themselves in Australia, so what would you say are the key aspects for Swedish businesses to consider either to remain or to become successful in Australia?
Again, this is a very important market for Swedish companies. Like I said, it's the fourth largest export market outside of EU. So it is an important, and a lot of Swedish companies have a long history and a solid track record here in Australia. And like Ambassador Cederin said, they are viewed, a lot of companies are actually viewed as being local already or domestic. But there are 5 strategic imperatives that we have highlighted for continued success. The first one, and I think all panelists will talk about this, it's the transition to a more sustainable Australia. And this is inevitable, and it creates a lot of opportunities for Swedish companies. And we would like Swedish companies to differentiate themselves and their offerings and pioneer sustainable solutions. And I think that would be very favorable if we can, as a group, take on that baton and actually drive the transition to become more sustainable. So that would be the first one. I think all companies, either present or companies who want to be present, I think they need to have a sustainable strategy going forward. Secondly, I would also like to stress the importance of being domestic. And this is where we have I would say, a shift in terms of how we phrase that word. Domestic is not just local. There's a lot of local Swedish companies here in Australia, but to become truly domestic, you need to invest in R&D. You need to have some local production, and you need to start to think about exporting from Australia to other markets as well. So I think this is very important, and I can't stress this enough. There's a lot of Swedish companies who, if you look at their operations, have been successful the last few decades. At the same time, if we move forward and if these companies will need to be successful for the coming decade, they need to rethink the way they do business, and they need to become much more domestic in their presence. I can elaborate on this at length, but I think I stopped there in terms of domestic. What I can also say is, for obvious reasons, stay premium. That's something that will always deliver value, and I think that's something that Swedish companies need to continue to push. That's something Swedish companies have done well in the past. Stay close to customers. Again, when we see a lot of these shifts happen, we have to stay close to customers, but I think that's just knocking in open doors. The last strategic imperative that I would like to stress is acquire local know-how. And what's interesting and what we've seen the last few years here in Australia, we see, because there's a lot of effort in developing local capabilities, we see a lot of innovation hubs, we see a lot of different sub-industries that actually blossom quite well. So again, coming back to becoming more domestic, if a Swedish company wants to become more domestic, there's an easy route in, or easy in brackets, to acquire some of these companies in order to build a local R&D or innovation hub or ecosystem, so to speak. So those are some of the 5 things that we would like to highlight.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Martin. And I can certainly attest to that, having been representing global businesses over here, that local presence beats Zoom, even though we're on Zoom today. Right, it looks like we have Jennifer back on. Excellent, I can hear your voice.
I'll have to try and speak really, really fast before I get cut off again.
No, I think we're on a good one now. Welcome back, and let's go back to my question about Austrade's focus.
Right. Well, look, I think we've covered a lot of ground since I dropped out. But as many of you will know, we have a presence in Sweden with 2 investment directors, Simon Gunn and Kerstin Klassen, who many of you know. And what we do accompany investors and try and make their lives just a little bit simpler. Firstly, in navigating some of the challenges. Obviously, you'll know that with travel restrictions, it's been quite complex to get to Australia. And so in some instances, we've been able to deblock these situations together with the help of Ambassador Philip to enable investors to travel. And the other point is that I think what's resonating now is that notwithstanding the incredible catastrophic nature of the pandemic, it has provided a lot of green shoots and growth opportunities, particularly for investment and reinvestment. Investors are taking this time to actually scope Australia and look at the opportunities. And we've been able to accompany investors virtually to provide them with information, even virtual site visits and meetings. And this kind of meeting has actually become really accessible. In terms of the new opportunities, look, I think we've pretty well touched on them, but it's clear that across the world, and particularly in Australia, we're very conscious of the recasting of global supply chains. There's a real focus now on resilience. And what we're seeing in turn here is an acceleration towards technologies which existed but now are having an incredibly emphasized focus, such as 3D printing, so that you don't have to worry about the fact that exports or imports mightn't be able to take place. They can be done locally. The acceleration of the adoption of digital technologies has, we've been forced to take these up. Human beings naturally resist change, obliged to embrace them. Martin also referred to an ambassador, Cederin also referred to the renewed focus on manufacturing and a strategy that the government will announce shortly. But in particular, I think in terms of opportunities, we're seeing this acceleration really towards the digital technologies, which is really transversal across every sector, whether that's agriculture, energy, any form of sector, fintech, digital technologies are absolutely vital. And during this crisis, what we're realizing is that it creates opportunities. Already we've seen opportunities in telehealth, telework, online education services, and that is going to grow. And it's quite interesting because just a few hours ago, the Australian government made further announcements about the way it's going to be fast-tracking Australia's digital economy. So there'll be more information about that. But that's a recognition of this acceleration in the adoption of digital technologies, and the fact that we have to now enable that. I think also this is complemented by a number of strategies that the Australian government has announced last year in 2019, but also further strategies that have been announced this year. And these are strategies which are going to help Australia's economic recovery, but there are also strategies which underline the compelling business case for investment in Australia. Ambassador Philip referred to the low emissions technology statement, which is really, really important and a really excellent sign, I think, particularly for investors like Swedish investors who are really considered to be global leaders in building a low carbon future. The IEA has certainly pointed to Sweden as a global leader in this area. So Swedish investors will be very well placed to leverage this opportunity. Last year, you will all recall also the announcement of a federal hydrogen strategy, which is being rolled out. And that is, on the one hand, aiming to enhance Australia's energy security, but it's also going to create jobs and also build a hydrogen export industry. As Martin referred to earlier, the important thing about investing into Australia and becoming local is also to have an export strategy and leverage the positioning of Australia in Asia Pacific as this hub for export. Another important initiative that I'd like to flag quickly also is around the circular economy. And this is once again a really interesting sector where Sweden has a huge role to play. Recently, the Australian government announced a $1 billion transformation of Australia's waste and recycling capacity. And this will be a strategy to invest in new technologies and new ideas to transform recycling and reprocessing. And this is surely an obvious area where we have a lot to learn from Sweden. Likewise, we've referred to this green recovery and the importance of sustainability. As you will all know, the Australian government continues to prioritise a number of infrastructure projects. We're looking to grow our cities, regulate our traffic and deal with transport challenges, but using a lot of smart solutions and transport technologies such as electric vehicle fleets. And once again, this is an area where Swedish investors have a really strong role to play. So I can really imagine that these recent announcements must be very pleasing to Swedish investors, and in particular, reinvestors. And by that I mean Swedish investors who are already on the ground in Australia, who are looking to diversify their portfolio. And so these announcements by the federal government in Australia certainly must give a lot of create a lot of appetite, I would say, for further Swedish investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you so much. And we're so happy we can hear you.
It'll probably drop out now.
No. Stay with us. Wonderful. Thank you to the panelists for your opening remarks. It's been a lot of insight, and I have for sure been taking notes. And as I mentioned earlier, we will record this. It will be available on our website. So there will be a lot to go back into and listen some more to. Now it's time for our Q&A session, and I see I already have a question going here, and this is a question directed basically to the entire panel. So anyone feel free to jump in. And the question is, how can Australia and Sweden cut red tape in big government tenders? There is a lot of discussion about innovation, but the tender processes becomes even stricter, i.e. very detailed specification requirements means by definition old well-known technologies. And this is a question from Jonas Lindholm. How can we make it easier? How can we support investors from both sides in this? Because as we all know, we need to maintain a good governance principle, but at the same time, we need to enable investment. How can we cut red tape? Anyone want to jump in?
I can try, Teresia.
Welcome.
Thank you. No, since I mentioned the free trade agreement negotiations earlier, I can also mention here that that public procurement is an important part of those negotiations, and we are ambitious from the European side, and we feel that we have definitely an interest on the Australian side to move forward and have a very good, ambitious chapter on public procurement in the coming future agreement. And when it comes to Australia, this would mean to create further transparency and regarding and have all the levels included, federal, state, and local level, because that is often a complicating factor in this economy. So that is what the EU negotiators are working towards, to create a further openness for European companies coming in here. At the same time, of course, we are also have an interest in firm standards. That is, I don't know if that is red tape. Red tape could be something else, but the firm standards, I would say, is very much in our interest, where our companies can compete from a very good footing. Thanks.
Thank you, Henrik. Anybody else wanting to comment on?
Thank you.
Red tape?
If I could just add, as Henrik mentioned, I think free trade agreements have a role to play in this, and Australia has made commitments in the FTAs that we've entered into and are in discussions with the EU about government procurement in the Australia-EU FTA. I think digital technology has a role to play. And I think the Australia being a federation, it is just one of the enduring features of the political and business environment that does present opportunities as well as sometimes challenges, and state governments will often be very forward-leaning in trying to create the best investment climates, but it is a challenge, government procurement.
Thank you, Bernard. Anybody else want to comment on this matter? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question. This is a very long question from Anders Liljeqvist in Sydney. Thank you, Anders. I will try and abbreviate it somehow. And the question is really very much about looking in the crystal ball. We know Australia's traditional trade footprint being very much around, very much focused around, I just lost my word, around I completely lost it. The wonderful stuff that we get from our farming and from our mining, the traditional industries. But what do we see as opportunities for businesses to focus on when it comes to moving away from the traditional trade footprint of Australia? Past coal and farming products. So we mentioned digital and sustainability obviously being very, very much a topic, not only in Australia, but across the globe, how to transition our economies. And I would imagine that is an area of opportunity.
I could make a start, if you like, on this. I think we do continue to see opportunities for Australia in some of those traditional areas, particularly in terms of gaining more share of the value chain, whether it's in agriculture or in mining. I think we see renewable technologies as presenting real opportunities for Australia to rebuild our manufacturing in some areas. And Jennifer mentioned the hydrogen strategy as being part of that. I'd certainly echo the comments that Henrik and Martin made about manufacturing being back on the agenda in Australia, and there being hubs in many different areas, and I think the real opportunity there is to grow those into bigger industries, and that's something that Sweden has traditionally been so successful at. I think there are opportunities for Swedish companies to support that growth in Australia in a wide range of areas. I think beyond hydrogen and energy, I think there is real opportunity for Australia in terms of critical minerals and capturing more of the value chain, but also really building an industry where we enhance our reputation as a reliable Australia for the technologies that are going to drive the green agenda. And finally, I think in defence and space and security, there are real opportunities that Australia is pursuing now that we have a very strong defence industry build up and strategy for a long-term industry. Sweden has already been an important part of that, and I think there will continue to be so, including using Australia as a base from which to expand into different parts of the defence security sector and then export into Asia.
Thank you, Bernard. Anybody else wanting to look in the crystal ball?
Teresia, echoing and just adding to Ambassador Phillips' comments, as we've been talking about just for the last 45 minutes, there's this increased focus on digital technologies, and so we will see further trade opportunities in digital services, for example, in healthcare. Healthcare has never been so important, sometimes have left to the side in the past, and now the focus on digital health, for example, and telemedicine, it's a whole industry that's going to grow exponentially, and so that's where Australia, with some of its technologies, it will seek to export these technologies, but also collaborating on projects with countries like Sweden to develop these digital technologies and in turn to be able to export them. So I think that digital trade and trade in services will really grow exponentially in the coming years.
Thank you. You know, there seems to be a real juncture here and opportunity between sustainability and digitalization. If I just may ask Martin a question, just from memory, at Business Sweden, you did a sustainability trade mission to Australia some years ago. And would you, who knows, would you see that this would be an initiative that would be revived and considering the demand for this, not only digitalization, but green transformation?
Well, yes. So we are currently doing a lot of online micro trade missions, and I think there's been a huge appetite for that. So we are currently focusing on smart cities with the Western City deal as the first focus area for us, and then obviously I think there's 8 more city deals that we are currently looking into. We have also launched or about to launch a mining platform focusing on sustainable mining. So that's also something that we see a huge appetite for, on both sides, actually, both from Sweden and from the Australian side. And I just want to echo this. This is really the key area that we go across all the different industry verticals going forward. This is actually a key area for the transition going forward, and not only within smart manufacturing or diversified trade, but getting the sustainability transition right will be crucial for the Australian economy going forward, I would say.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, we look forward to that. Just to wrap up the Q&A session here, I thought of a general question, which is maybe a little bit philosophical, but this webinar is headlined to reflect on the conditions post-COVID. But the question is there in fact an end to the COVID pandemic, or will we need to reframe our thinking and look at a world where we actually will continue to live with COVID for a long time still to come? Is there anyone who wants to comment on that? Is COVID here to stay, and is it going to impact us in a more permanent way than what we maybe are seeing today?
Teresia, if I could jump in with one answer to the question. I mean, I'll perhaps dodge the philosophical aspect because it is so uncertain, and I think we'll see some aspects of how we're operating now continue into the post-COVID period, including working remotely and greater use of digital technology. But the point I wanted to touch upon was mobility, particularly of professionals and highly skilled labour. I mean, that's underpinned Australia's economic success in recent decades, and we recognise that we'll have to rebuild that in the post-COVID era as travel opens up. I think it is encouraging to see that the government has already put in place arrangements to take that effort forward, and I'd alert people in particular to the Global Business and Talent Attraction Task Force, where it's a combination of state governments, the federal government and business, looking to provide streamlined pathways for professionals. And so I think that people mobility underpins a lot of the business links, and that's something I think Australia will really want to rebuild in the post-COVID era, which hopefully will enter before too long.
Well, that's wonderful news to my ears, and to many of our members here in Australia as well, to hear that. Any other comments that before we wrap it up? No, well, thank you, Bernard, for your comments were the last one from our panel, and a big thank you to all our panelists for coming to us today and to share so generously with us your views and your experience, because obviously you have, being in the position you are, you have a very specific optic that is not maybe generally viewed by the rest of us. Thank you so much, and thank you also to our audience for joining us yet again to one of our webinars. We have certainly pivoted as a chamber over the past 6 months and found this digital meeting to connect with you, and we are extremely grateful that you have embraced it, because we didn't know what we were setting out to do when we decided to do it. So thank you also for joining. But before we sign off, I wanted to give a little bit of a plug for events coming up in the chamber here in Australia. And the first one is already tomorrow. And if you haven't already registered, you're still able to join, because tomorrow on the 30th of September, we have a joint event in collaboration with the Nordic chambers in Australia called Renewable Clean Energy. On the 14th of October, we have a webinar on women in technology. And this is a webinar in collaboration with ABB. The same day is also a very special day, because it's the first time we are going through the chamber offer a training course. And this is a training course in digital marketing. And deadline for registrations is on the 30th of September. The 30th of October is also the deadline for entries to the Swedish Business Awards in Australia. So please contact Camilla or join our website to see the requirements for entry, but we would love to see more businesses and individuals entering the awards that we will hold at some point in the future. We can't tell you just yet how that's going to happen, but it has been a very good initiative for so many years for us, and it's a wonderful way to highlight our beautiful relationship between Australia and Sweden, and the fantastic businesses we have here with that mutual connection. So with that, I would like to thank everyone again for participating today, and we from the Chamber wish you all a very productive and successful rest of the week.